distinguished ministers, ambassadors, briefers, and all those watching us online. Let me welcome you on behalf of Estonia and 31 co-sponsors, France, Ireland, Norway, the United Kingdom, the United States, Albania, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Costa Rica, Croatia, Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Netherlands, North Macedonia, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Ukraine. Our third meeting in this format and the tripled number of co-sponsors demonstrates that human rights violations and transnational repressions by the authorities of Belarus have implications for international peace and security. Today's meeting will focus on the deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus and the grave violations of international law. Allow me first to make some organizational remarks. We will have 39 speakers today, including 9 ministers and 5 vice ministers. I am pleased to welcome our distinguished briefers, who will contribute to our discussion with their expertise, insights, and personal engagement. There will be a keynote speech by Ms. Ilse Brands-Keris, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, followed by other distinguished briefers. After that, there will be statements by co-sponsors, Security Council members, other United Nations member states, and by an observer. I'm particularly glad to welcome the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Latvia, Mr. Rinkevich, and Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, Mr. Adomėnas, here in the studio with us, sharing their views. Today's meeting is streamed live and is open to public via several channels: United Nations Web TV, Facebook, and YouTube. The recording will remain publicly accessible after the meeting. Our working language is English. We will post the full version of your statements online. Please be so kind and send them to the email address you are seeing on the screen. Without further delay, allow me now to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker. I invite Ms. Ilse Brands-Keris to address us. Ms. Brands-Keris has in-depth expertise in conflict prevention and human rights, and extensive work experience with international and regional organizations and civil society. From 2017 to 2019, she served as a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Ms. Brands-Keris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs Eva-Maria Limets. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity to brief on the human rights situation in Belarus. On 24th of September, the High Commissioner for Human Rights presented to the Human Rights Council her interim oral update on the human rights situation in Belarus, pursuant to Resolution 46/20, which requested her to carry out a comprehensive examination of all alleged human rights violations committed in Belarus since 1st of May 2020, with assistance from relevant experts and special procedures mandate holders. In her update, the High Commissioner reiterated her concerns over the human rights situation in Belarus, including the persisting limitations to the civic space and media freedom, allegations of widespread and systematic torture and ill treatment in the context of arbitrary arrests and detention of protesters. More specifically, she expressed alarm at persistent allegations of widespread and systematic torture and ill treatment in the context of arbitrary arrest and detention. We have no evidence today of any genuine and impartial investigations into reports of incidents that took place during the dispersal of demonstrations in the days following 9th of August 2020. We recall that during these incidents, hundreds of protesters were violently beaten by security officers, in particular by riot police and special police forces. Many protesters, including children, were also subjected to ill treatment in detention. At least 4 protesters died. We remain concerned about the increasing restrictions on civic space and fundamental freedoms, including continuing patterns of police raids and searches of civil society organizations and independent media, and the arrests and criminal prosecutions of human rights defenders and journalists. We note that many have fled the country since the 2020 presidential elections. In addition, reports have been received of over 800 individuals being imprisoned in Belarus because of their opinions, among them members of the opposition, human rights defenders, journalists and media workers, protesters and activists, including the chair of well-known human rights group Vyasna. Numerous people have been charged with what appear to be politically motivated criminal cases, and in September alone, at least 103 people were convicted of such. As of 1st of October, at least 20 journalists and media workers remain in detention. In this still deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus, I reiterate our call once again on the government of Belarus to cease their activity and their policy of intimidating and harassing civil society and media workers. Those still detained should be released immediately. Last week, the Supreme Court of Belarus upheld the decision to dissolve the Belarusian Helsinki Committee, one of the oldest NGOs defending human rights in the country. Other organizations, such as the Belarusian Association of Journalists or the Belarusian Pen Center, had been previously shut down. According to civil society sources, by the end of September 2021, at least 275 civil society organizations had been closed down or were in the process of being liquidated by the authorities. As stated by the High Commissioner, the scale and pattern of behavior by the Belarusian authorities to date strongly suggest that limitations to freedoms of expression and assembly, among other human rights, are primarily aimed at suppressing criticism of and dissent from government policies, rather than any aim regarded as legitimate under human rights law, such as protection of public order. It is essential for the future of the country that respect for human rights and a broad and open civic space be established. All those who have been detained for peacefully exercising their rights should be released. With regard to the persistent allegations of widespread and systematic torture and ill treatment in the context of arbitrary arrests and detention of protesters, I wish to reiterate that independent, impartial, prompt, thorough, effective, and transparent investigations must be conducted into all allegations of serious human rights violations, and perpetrators of such violations must be brought to justice and full reparations to victims of violations provided. Excellencies, in the last months, migrants, including asylum seekers, from third countries have repeatedly been encouraged by the Belarusian authorities to cross the country's borders with neighbouring EU member states, notably Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. First and foremost, let us always remember that these individuals who appear to be stranded along the border are human beings and must not be abused as political instruments or bargaining chips. They find themselves in vulnerable situations, and their human rights must be fully respected by all duty bearers. We have seen public reports of pushbacks and lack of humanitarian assistance, and meanwhile the harsh physical conditions of these individuals, including children, can only get worse with the arrival of the winter and colder temperatures. Border governance measures must respect the human rights of these individuals, including the right to food, water, medical care, and adequate shelter. The right to seek and enjoy asylum or other protection under international human rights and refugee law requires an individual assessment of their personal circumstances and protection needs prior to any expulsion. Collective expulsion and refoulement are prohibited. The death of several people near the border between Belarus and Poland since mid-September reflects the failure to uphold these rights. These cases must be independently and effectively investigated. As stated earlier this week by UN independent human rights experts, the states concerned must now work together to save the lives of all those stranded at their common border. Political considerations should give way to the protection of the human rights of asylum seekers and other migrants. To this end, we stand ready to support member states concerned in their efforts to comply with international law. We likewise call for humanitarian actors, lawyers, journalists, and civil society organizations to be granted access to the border areas. Excellencies, let me conclude by reiterating the continued need for a meaningful and inclusive dialogue with the Belarusian authorities and civil society, with a view to ensuring respect for human rights and the broadening of civic space. We also stress the need for constructive multilateral engagement. We believe that SDG implementation and the body of recommendations stemming from various international human rights mechanisms, including the Universal Periodic Review, can create a solid ground for further constructive engagement. Our office reiterates its readiness to continue to support Belarusian authorities to that end. Finally, we call upon the Belarusian authorities to extend full and transparent access to the country to enable OHCHR to carry out its mandate in line with Human Rights Council Resolution 46/20. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Branskeris, for your comprehensive and substantial briefing. Our next briefer is Mr. Artyom Shryban, a political analyst from Belarus, currently based in Ukraine, who specializes in the foreign and domestic policies of Belarus. He is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Moscow Center and the founder of Sense Analytics, a political consultancy. Mr. Shryban has previously worked for Belarus media outlets Bil Pan and Tut Bai, both of which were forced to close down in 2021. Mr. Shryban, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Excellency, dear ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The protracted political crisis in Belarus for a while remained mostly a domestic issue. The heavy-handed government's crackdown on the protest following the contested presidential election of 2020 manifested itself in large-scale repressions against political leaders and activists, media, civil society, lawyers, athletes, even the clergy, and other social groups that showed signs of aligning with the protest. Several people lost their lives, thousands reported mistreatment and torture in custody, tens of thousands were detained or arrested, hundreds have become political prisoners. Yet this dire human rights crisis at first caused only limited reaction from the international community, which is understandable. Belarus is not the only place in the world experiencing the use of violence against pro-democratic movements. The crisis got to a qualitatively new level in May 2021, when Alyaksandr Lukashenka ordered to land a Ryanair commercial flight with an oppositional journalist Roman Protasevich on board. The authorities claimed they received 2 emails warning about the possible bomb on that flight, but the email service ProtonMail said that there was only 1 email coming after the crew of the flight was told to land in Minsk. The incident was widely perceived as to be an act of international air piracy and a very alarming precedent, a breach of trust in international civil aviation. At that moment, Belarusian political crisis ceased to be a domestic matter. Minsk has abandoned its aspired image of the Eastern European Switzerland, a donor of regional stability and security, instead becoming a donor of regional instability. Expectedly, the West got way more serious and introduced painful economic sanctions against most profitable sectors of Belarusian economy. Minsk responded with another crackdown, officially labeled as the Purge. In retaliation for sanctions, nearly all visible civil society organizations and independent media in the country were eliminated over the summer of 2021. The number of political prisoners exceeded 800. In the meantime, Minsk has opened another front. After Lukashenko repeatedly stated that in the face of Western pressure, Belarus spends too much money and efforts on preventing irregular migrants from getting into the EU, the flow of these people to neighbouring Lithuania, then Latvia and Poland has been breaking all the possible records. According to the EU authorities, there have been more than 6,000 irregular border crossings from Belarus since the beginning of this year. This is already 40 times higher than in 2020. According to multiple reports from the ground, These people coming from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and other countries of the region arrive in organized groups. They are met by their coordinators of their tours at the Minsk airport. For some time, some of them reside at Belarusian hotels. Then they are either transferred to the western borders of Belarus or get there on their own. There have already been several fatal cases of people freezing to death at the border. Minsk allows, and some would argue orchestrates, this flow of migrants to reach three objectives. The first one is retribution. In the eyes of Belarusian decision-makers, Vilnius and Warsaw have to be punished for their sins of harboring Lukashenko political opponents, for supporting Belarusian civil society, and for being the most vocal advocates of sanctions against Belarusian authorities. It is basically an attempt to raise the price of being tough against Lukashenko and his associates. The second objective is to compel the EU and the immediate Belarusian neighbors to sit down at the negotiations table with Lukashenko, thereby recognizing his legitimacy as the leader who can actually solve the migration crisis. So the second objective is a strive for recognition. But the third objective, the third reason for creating new tensions with neighbors, is domestic and arguably the most concerning one. Belarusian political regime got itself to a condition where the constant escalation is vital and indispensable element of preserving power. The atmosphere of a permanent foreign threat, hybrid Western attack on Belarus, being surrounded by aggressive enemies, is the only source of mobilization and legitimacy within the current support base of Alyaksandr Lukashenko and his security apparatus. He also needs this confrontation to convince Russia that Lukashenko's government must be supported in the face of common enemies. This is why, in my assessment, the escalation is bound to continue. At the moment, Minsk has all the incentives to proceed. Even if the neighbors of Belarus manage to somehow curb the migration crisis, this escalation might find new forms and dimensions. In this regard, one of the most troubling signals is the recent tragedy which happened in Minsk. KGB officers were conducting a raid as they claimed to find potential terrorists. Unfortunately, in the present-day Belarus, it might be enough to be an active protester to be qualified as terrorist or an accomplice in terrorism. When the KGB entered one of the apartments, they met armed resistance. An IT manager, Andrei Zeltser, opened fire, killing one of the KGB men and being killed in the process himself. In the aftermath of this tragedy, Belarusian authorities arrested more than 200 people who either spoke bad of the shot KGB officer on their social media or dared to express condolences to the family of Zeltser, the IT manager. The rhetoric of Belarusian authorities is no less troubling than their actions. Ranking members of parliament and senior officials of the law enforcement called for retaliation against the opposition in exile, who, according to Belarusian authorities, inspired the shooting. Some state-affiliated opinion leaders call for targeted assassinations, similar to what Israeli intelligence services conducted in the past. Primetime state TV presenters called for kidnapping leaders of the opposition from Poland and Lithuania and bringing them to Belarus to prosecute. A week ago, Lukashenko himself said, and I quote, "If these scoundrels think that we will not get them abroad, they are mistaken." I'm afraid that this might not be just empty threats. The logic of escalation pushes Belarusian authorities to more extreme and desperate steps. Since the domestic political field, media, and civil society have been effectively mopped up, there is not too much space for further crackdown at home. In these circumstances, the only reasonable expectation is, unfortunately, further confrontation with the immediate neighbors, except for Russia, and with the West in general. Thank you.
My sincere thanks to you, Mr. Schreibman, for your courage, commitment, and for being with us today. Now, I am glad to introduce two briefers who are contributing to the work of the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. First, we will hear a statement by Mr. Jens Modvig, who serves as the head of the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. Mr. Modvig has been working for anti-torture organizations for more than 25 years. Before joining the International Accountability Platform for Belarus, he was the chairperson of the United Nations Committee Against Torture. Mr. Modvig, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Minister, Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The International Accountability Platform was launched in March this year. It was created to collect, consolidate, verify, and preserve information, documentation, and evidence of gross human rights violations constituting crimes under international law committed in Belarus since 9 August 2020. This is done with the view to facilitating criminal investigations and criminal proceedings in accordance with international law standards. The platform, as an NGO consortium, is supported by 20 states as well as the EU. The support from states was expressed in a joint statement issued on 24 March 2021. The platform comprises a steering committee and an advisory council. The steering committee comprises Dignity as a lead and 3 co-leads, namely Vyasna, International Committee for the Investigation of Torture in Belarus, and Redress. The advisory council comprises 8 international and 6 Belarusian organizations, all with specialized expertise in fields relevant to the work of the platform. Further, the platform secretariat is based in Copenhagen. The platform will, as part of its objectives, create and maintain a coherent database of available documentation. It will verify and analyze available data with a view to identifying what information can serve any further independent criminal investigations and criminal proceedings, and it will identify gaps in the existing data and undertake efforts to fill these gaps by collecting additional information and evidence. The platform is engaging with the OHCHR examination. The platform and the examination have met on several occasions to discuss modalities of cooperation. The platform has also engaged with other UN actors to elicit advice on various operational issues. Belarusian human rights organizations and initiatives have documented alleged human rights violations and international crimes committed since and even before August 2020. Numerous victims of alleged arbitrary arrest and detention, torture, ill treatment, and sexual violence have been interviewed by those organizations for the purposes of documentation. Along with testimonies, the organizations gathered medical reports and additional supporting information. Procedures for informed consent, which allows for the sharing of data to pursue accountability, have consistently been implemented. The platform secretariat has planned and carried out the first preliminary analysis of the collected evidence. A batch of witness statements and medical reports were analyzed thoroughly by a multidisciplinary team with legal and forensic medical backgrounds, and the analysis of a new batch of testimonies is planned to be carried out in the nearest future. The analytic results will feed into the platform's work, hereunder the planning and preparation of new phases of the investigation. The platform gives top priority to upholding the highest security standards. Preventing the leak of sensitive data is considered the most important measure to protect persons, including those who provided their data to the platform and those engaged in the work of the platform. The focused analysis of the case material will guide case building, which will take place in consultation with prosecutorial authorities that intend or have already opened an investigation into the situation in Belarus. In conclusion, the platform is an unprecedented investigation mechanism, which, with the state support, is able to collect and analyze evidence that might otherwise be lost for subsequent accountability processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Modvik, very much for joining us and bringing your valuable insights to our discussion. Now I will turn to Ms. Victoria Fedorova, who represents the International Committee for the Investigation of Torture in Belarus. which belongs to the steering committee of the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. Since August 2020, this committee has documented more than 1,500 cases of torture. Ms. Fedorova, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Human rights defenders continue to document cases of torture and inhumane treatment in Belarus. Despite thousands of complaints to investigative authorities, not a single criminal case has been opened in connection with the alleged torture. On 26 August 2021, a statement issued by the Investigative Committee of Belarus announced that allegations of torture and other crimes against international law, including severe deprivation of liberty and sexual violence, will not result in the initiation of criminal investigations or prosecution by competent state authorities. According to the statement, all use of physical force by state authorities was in accordance with Belarusian law. This statement demonstrates the unwillingness of Belarus to conduct prompt, effective, and impartial investigations into allegation of the involvement of state authorities in crimes against humanity. Moreover, victims who want to appeal against the refusal to initiate a criminal case cannot study the case file because cases allegedly contain information classified as state secrets. Therefore, it's impossible to achieve accountability at the national level. The ongoing massive violation of human rights are aggravated by attacks on civil society in general and human rights defenders in particular. Since July this year, almost 300 NGOs were liquidated. Among the liquidated organizations are the Belarusian Helsinki Committee, the Belarusian Association of Journalists, and my organization Legal Initiative. These are organizations that have been working in Belarus for the protection and promotion of human rights for 25 years. In July, dozens of searches have been conducted in the offices of a wide range of civil society organizations and in private apartments of individual human rights defenders. Now, 7 members of Human Rights Center Vyasna in prison. Chairperson Olесь Belyatsky, Deputy Chairperson Valentin Stefanovich, lawyer Vladimir Lapkovich, coordinator of Vyasna Network of Volunteers Marfa Rabkova, head of Vyasna office in Gomel Leonid Sudalenko, volunteers Tatiana Lasitsa and Andrei Chepyuk. This major crackdown on civil society in Belarus is yet another attempt of the Lukashenko regime to silence dissent, restrict fundamental human rights, and stop legitimate documentation of the regime's human rights violations. This documentation is necessary for bringing perpetrators to justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fedorova, for sharing your views. Last but not least, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Anna Maria Döner, a political analyst at the Polish Institute of Foreign Affairs. Ms. Döner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Excellencies. Thank you, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Estonian Ministry for Foreign Affairs for invitation. And as organizers asked me to talk about migration crisis on border between Belarus and 3 EU/NATO members, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, I will try to focus just on that. But I will also start with a short piece of theory. First of all, I would like to stress that using migrants as a tool of political pressure is nothing new in contemporary international history. Kelly Greenhill, in her book Weapons of Mass Migration, presented 64 such cases between 1953 and 2006. They were used in almost every part of the world. Unfortunately, majority of them was succeed because humanitarian issues are very important for democratic states. Why unfortunately? Because it's so profitable to use migrants as a political tool of influence. And here comes a very important point. Migrants and migration crises are used by non-democratic regimes against democracies. The 2 main goals of non-democratic actors are, first of all, to create a crisis in a state that have insufficient infrastructure to provide assistance to migrants, And second of all, to create a social and political crisis, rise polarization within the societies that are divided in their attitude towards immigration, policy, and security issues. Moreover, migration as a tool of influence is used by a weaker side against a stronger one, which is also a definition of hybrid threats. All that means that triggering a migration crisis can be treated as a part of hybrid warfare, and as such is treated nowadays by European Commission and NATO. And here comes contemporary crisis on border between Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland, created by Belarusian regime. When we look into the details, it is visible that it wasn't just a simple answer of Belarusian regime against the EU countries that imposed sanctions on Belarus. Preparation to trigger the current migration crisis had begun a few months earlier than in the middle of May, when Lithuanian border guards started to report first illegal crossing borders. Then, just by the small groups of people, especially from Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. Two crucial dates. First of all, it's 1st February of this year, when Alyaksandr Lukashenka approves the state border protection plan for this year and talked about migration crisis and migration challenges. Then, the 3rd of March, Belarus eased and lifted the penalties for illegal stay in the border area. They changed their penal code. And third date, 28th of June, the Belarusian Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced the suspension of implementation of readmission agreement between Belarus and the EU. So when all of those exactly begins? Officially on 14th of May, Lithuanian border guard detained first 6 migrants from Syria that illegally crossed the border with Belarus. Second group of 17 migrants was detained a few days after. Then all those means that everything started more than a week before Belarusian authorities forced Ryanair plane flying from Athens to Vilnius to land in Minsk. All those means that everything started 2 weeks before the EU expanded the package of restrictions imposed on Belarus. All that means that in a first state, it was rather, in quotation marks, part of something like first attempts to use hybrid threat against Lithuania, the country that gave a shelter for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and plenty of Belarusian oppositionists. After a few weeks of such kind of policy, it occurred that it's not only bringing a political tools, that is why I told you about main goals of non-democratic states, but it started to be profitable from state and related to the state companies. According to some unofficial data, the price for shifting one person to the border with EU countries cost more or less $5,000. And when this crisis started in a border with Poland, according to data of Polish border guard, it was the beginning of August, but even in July, they fixed more than 167 cases of illegally crossing border. In August, 3,000. For now, it's more than 13,500 of illegal attempts to cross Polish border. And here comes one important moment. At the beginning of August, Poland provided protection to Krystyna Timanowskaya, a runner, participant of Olympic Games, that should be almost evacuated from Tokyo, because if not, she will be forced to take responsibility for criticizing the sport authorities. Because of this scandal, media among the whole world reminded about the situation in Belarus. It can't be also excluded that Belarus and Russia consider that this crisis may be also used as a part of rising tensions before and during the active phases of this year's Zapad drills. I just want to stress that according to the scenario of these exercises, the attack of 3 artificial states on the Union state was preceded by a crisis at the border. So all it served to escalate tensions in the region and led to introduction of emergency states in parts of Lithuania, 2nd July, Latvia, 9 August, and Poland, 2nd September. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, ministers, instead of summary, the crisis on Belarus border will continue, which is In example, evidences by flight, an example from Damascus that had landed in Minsk on Monday and Tuesday. As Lukashenko regime wants to achieve three goals. First is to distract the world from mass repression in Belarus and the internal situation in this country. Second, to force the EU to negotiate issues of sanctions and recognition of Lukashenko as the president. And to further to destabilize the situation in Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland by provoking and heating up internal disputes, undermining trust in uniformed services, the border guard, the police, the army, and dividing the EU and NATO, and undermining the position of three countries mentioned that pursue a policy aimed at the activities of the regime. Thank you very much for your attention.
I convey our thanks to you, Ms. Turner, for adding your voice to the discussion. I thank once again all of our guest speakers. Now we turn to the statements by the representatives of the co-sponsors of today's meeting. Distinguished colleagues, guests, audience online, and dear people of Belarus, allow me first to make a statement in my national capacity. When we met last time in this format in January this year, we expressed our deep concern about what was and still is happening in the heart of Europe, in a founding member state of the United Nations. The political repressions in Belarus, beating, torture, imprisonments, intimidations, suppression of free media, internet shutdown, as well as online content blocking, continue to worsen. Back in January, we were talking about 170 political prisoners. Today, the number is exceeding 700 and is still growing, which is deeply worrisome. We share the sorrow of those hundreds behind the bars and of those thousands who have been forced to flee the country. We share the disappointment of those who have found their hopes for free elections brutally crushed. In our last meeting, almost 10 months ago, we focused on restrictions of media freedom in Belarus, which threaten peace in the country. Since then, we have regrettably seen a further degradation of press freedom. A few months ago, the authorities of Belarus dissolved the Belarusian Association of Journalists, one of the Belarus' most prominent civil society organizations promoting freedom of speech and professional standards of journalism. Today, we are in a situation where there is not a single media outlet left in Belarus that can be considered free. These are just few examples of the negative developments that have taken place since the beginning of this year. We have also seen a truly alarming episode which resulted in a forced landing of an international passenger flight in May. This unprecedented act by the authorities of Belarus did not just put a large number of lives at risk, it was also a clear violation of international law, widely seen as a threat against peace and security, and met with international condemnation. Dear colleagues, distinguished ministers, briefers, and ambassadors, in June, the authorities of Belarus went even further by launching a politically motivated hybrid action against its neighbors. They have been luring thousands of third country nationals to Belarus, issuing them tourist visa, bringing them to the European Union-Belarus border, and forcing them to illegally cross to neighboring countries. The objective of the authorities of Belarus with this hybrid action and manipulation of human beings has been to destabilize its neighboring countries and divert attention from increasing human rights violations in Belarus. It is certainly unacceptable to take advantage of vulnerable individuals from third countries and to instrumentalize them for political purposes in this manner. All of these actions demonstrate that the domestic democracy crisis has started to spill over into a regional threat to peace and security. These developments also highlight the deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus. The international community has not turned a blind eye on this. The EU has deemed it necessary to impose restrictive measures and continues to react in a principled manner. Reversal of EU sanctions will only be possible once the authorities in Belarus fully adhere to the principles of democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights. The Security Council has informally discussed the situation in Belarus several times since the 2020 fraudulent elections. In March this year, the International Accountability Platform for Belarus was created. Estonia has supported this initiative as one of the donors. I'm glad that Mr. Jens Modvig, head of the platform, is here with us today and highlighted the important work they are doing on the collection and verification of information and evidence of serious violations of international human rights law committed in Belarus in the run-up of the 2020 presidential elections and its aftermath. In conclusion, allow me to reiterate that the politically motivated trials and the severe sentences that followed the brutal suppression of political dissidents should not be left unpunished. The people of Belarus are not alone. We call on Belarus to end the violence and immediately and unconditionally release all political prisoners. The international community must keep its focus on the situation on the ground until the people of Belarus can truly exercise their rights and freedoms as stipulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you. Allow me now to welcome to the stage the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Latvia, His Excellency Mr. Rinkevich.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank my Estonian colleague, Eva-Maria Limets, for hosting us today. I welcome this very timely discussion on Belarus, the human rights situation in Belarus, and the country's behavior in the region demands immediate and close international attention. The fraudulent elections last year triggered massive Belarusian public disapproval. Instead of engaging with the civil society, the regime violently oppressed the peaceful protests. It used methods unheard of before. First diversion of a flight to arrest a political opponent can be described in no other terms but terroristic. Today, we heard testimonies on brutal violations of human rights in Belarus. Latvia was one of the first countries to provide support to Belarusian people after the repression started. Medical aid, psychological support, legal assistance, scholarships, immediate help to journalists and other media workers. Thousands of Belarusians had to flee the country, many of them finding rescue in neighbouring countries, including my own country. Since the summer, we see Belarusian regime organizing the arrivals of people from third countries to Belarus, promising them easy access to the European Union. When these people realize that they have been lured into Belarus and the EU borders are protected, they face difficulties to return to their home countries. The regime is using threats and physical force to push them to cross the EU border illegally. The main goal of this is to destabilize the EU and the three neighbouring EU countries in particular. This is a clear retaliation for us being decisive in our support to Belarusian civil society and for giving shelter and protection to Belarusian people demanding free and fair elections in their country. The regime is conducting a hybrid attack. It is organized not only to influence the EU, but also to bring financial profit from these illegal activities. And in this respect, the actions of Belarus authorities resemble the ones of people smugglers and organized crime networks. In addition, the operation is accompanied by a massive disinformation campaign to discredit the neighbouring EU countries and to divert the attention from Lukashenko government brutality against their own people. I call on the international community to be firm in its demand to Belarus to comply with its international obligations, to stop the brutal human rights violations and the inhumane policy of instrumentalizing people from third countries for political purposes. The international community has to clearly see these deplorable actions for what they are. We must not accept that the international attention to human rights violation in a country is diverted by destabilizing activities towards other countries. We must not allow this to be set as pattern for others to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. Now please welcome to the stage the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, His Excellency Mr. Adomėnas.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank Estonia for organizing this meeting. It is very important that the international community keeps its attention on the situation in Belarus, despite the spreading of misinformation on this issue. Actions of the Belarus regime should be seen in a broader context, beginning from ongoing systematic destruction of NGO and civic space on the national level, creating the irregular migration crisis by seeking to destabilize the region, and enjoying the impunity because of lack of effective international accountability mechanisms. Let me speak in more detail on each of these. Human rights situation in Belarus continues to deteriorate. We condemn repressions by the Lukashenko regime against civil society, human rights defenders, journalists, and media workers. The liquidation of the Belarusian Helsinki Committee, one of the oldest human rights organizations in Belarus, is totally unacceptable. We strongly condemn arbitrary arrests and detentions, enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, and torture of the members of civil society. The regime is trying to silence the remaining independent voices, including those of women. Once again, we call for immediate cessation of all repressions and for the release of all political prisoners, whose number has almost reached 800. On the regional level, Lithuania, together with Latvia and Poland, are witnessing large-scale hybrid attack by the Belarusian authorities, which instrumentalize migrants and refugees from the third countries and aim to exert political pressure and destabilize the situation in the EU countries. This is the regime's reaction to the long-standing policies of the EU member states in supporting people of Belarus. Lithuania, in particular, has been accepting Belarusians seeking asylum because of repressions in their own country, and will continue to support Belarusian people, civil society, human rights defenders, as well as independent media. We appreciate all the international support received in response to the Lukashenko regime's hybrid attack. We also underline the vulnerabilities of the migrant groups that the Belarus regime cynically exploits for its political ends. Because of this hybrid operation, there is in Belarus an increasing number of vulnerable migrants, including women and children, whose fundamental human rights are being violated, whose lives and health are put in real danger. The entire responsibility for the consequences rests with the Belarusian regime. We must ensure that the regime is held to account for these actions. It is time for the international community to give a strong response to the deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus. Lithuania expresses its support to international accountability mechanisms, assuring that perpetrators of human rights violations in Belarus will be brought to justice. We strongly support both the mandate of the OHCHR approved in the 46th Human Rights Council session and the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. We call on Belarus to stop the actions which threaten the lives of vulnerable people and international security. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I would like to give the floor to Canada, Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Garneau. Mr. Garneau, the floor is yours.
Merci et bonjour. Many thanks to my Estonian counterpart, Minister Liimets, for hosting us to Canada's fellow meeting co-sponsors, and to all member states here today. As many have already stated, human rights violations and aggression being committed by Belarusian officials are completely unacceptable. That is why Canada was amongst the first countries to impose sanctions against the Lukashenka regime. More recently, on the first anniversary of the fraudulent presidential elections, Canada imposed additional sanctions. Colleagues, Lukashenka lacks the legitimacy to lead Belarus. Canada, alongside international partners, will not relent in opposing his regime and in working to end impunity for human rights abuses. Unfortunately, such abuses have only intensified since our last meeting. The forced diversion and landing of Ryanair Flight 4978 in May and the subsequent arrest of 2 passengers, a journalist and his companion, was a brazen act against media freedom. This act not only showed a flagrant disregard for long-standing international norms, it also jeopardized safe skies everywhere. As a former transport minister, I'm personally appalled at this recklessness, and I can tell you that Canadians feel the same way. Trust between pilots and air traffic controllers is critically important, and such acts erode pilots' trust in the integrity of air traffic instructions. The international community has to make it clear that such events cannot become common occurrences. We need to work collaboratively to strengthen the international rules-based order. Canada also condemns Belarus's manipulation of the flow of migrants as a pressure tactic against bordering countries who oppose the Lukashenka regime. This is unacceptable. It not only shows a threat to regional security, it also shows a blatant disregard for human rights. Canada will continue to work with its European Union, United Kingdom, and American partners to press for the release of Belarusians arbitrarily detained, particularly journalists and human rights defenders. We will continue to push for meaningful dialogue between the authorities and the opposition, and most importantly, we will seek to end to state-sponsored violence and human rights abuses. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Slovenia, Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Logar.
Yeah. Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Estonia for hosting this third Arria meeting in a year dedicated to the situation in Belarus. Unfortunately, the continuity of these meetings indicates that there is still no light at the end of the tunnel. On the contrary, the regime has spread its malicious activities and behavior beyond its border. This makes it our duty to keep Belarus high on the international agenda, maintain the pressure on the regime, and denounce its wrongdoings. We highly appreciate the presentation by the keynote speaker and the briefers. Your in-depth analysis and reporting are key for a thorough understanding of how wide and how deep the political and human rights crisis in Belarus has gone. Your systematic and extensive documentation of grave human rights violations and oppression will be, when the time comes, essential to hold the responsible actors accountable. In this regard, let me point out the need for a comprehensive investigation of the crimes committed by the Lukashenko regime against the people of Belarus. Madam Chair, ever since the fraudulent presidential election a year ago, the human rights situation in Belarus continues to deteriorate. The regime has continued with severe repressions against its own people, civil society, and the NGOs in the country. Numerous media outlets have been shut down, and journalists are constantly under attack. A number of politically motivated trials have resulted in severe consequences and sentences. Such unacceptable behavior has spilled over to the country's neighbors, as it orchestrates migration to its external borders. Slovenia strongly condemns instrumentalization of migrants for political purposes and calls upon the Belarusian authorities to respect their international commitments. We continue to support the Belarusian people in their legitimate demands for free and fair elections and for the respect of fundamental freedoms and human rights. Repression of the civil society calls for strong and united condemnation. As Svetlana Tikhanovskaya stressed upon her 2 visits in Slovenia, the international support is of paramount importance for the democratic forces in her country and for all who demand democratic representation, political participation and dignity. Without international pressure, inadmissible violence committed by the Belarusian authorities against their own people will go on. Finally, we call on the authorities to grant immediate and unimpeded access to the international organization and mechanism and to start implementing the OSCE's Moscow mechanism recommendations, starting with a genuine and inclusive national dialogue with the opposition and civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Denmark, Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Kofod, who will deliver a statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland.
Your Excellency, members of the Security Council, I deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. We welcome today's opportunity to discuss the aggressive behaviour of the Belarusian authorities against their own citizens and neighbouring countries. I would like to thank the briefers for their insightful and first-hand reports about the situation. The Belarusian authorities have committed serious and unprecedented human rights violations since August last year. We cannot stand idle by the act of torture and other ill treatment, including sexual and gender-based violence. The Belarusian authorities must live up to the country's international commitments and obligations to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. They must release all political prisoners and other arbitrarily detained. The Belarusian authorities have rejected calls to investigate and prosecute the numerous reported cases of violence and torture committed by the authorities. We call for accountability, an immediate end to repression, and the release of all political prisoners. Cases of torture must be investigated and perpetrators must be brought to account. We support international initiatives to hold perpetrators accountable, including to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, examination on Belarus, and the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. The Lukashenko regime has sought to instrumentalize irregular third country migration in an attempt to destabilize EU member states. We strongly condemn the Belarusian authorities' instrumentalization of the migrants and refugees and the exploitation of their vulnerability for political purposes. Your Excellency, we commend the Belarusian civil society, journalists and media for their courageous effort in documenting the brutality. These are crucial contributions to the effort aiming at restoring justice. International solidarity with the people of Belarus is more important than ever. We share their vision and hope of a democratic, independent, sovereign, prosperous and stable Belarus. And we will continue to support their struggle for justice. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Greece, Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Dendias.
Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, I would like to thank the Foreign Minister of Estonia, Ms. Limets, my dear Eva Maria, for the kind invitation to speak at this timely meeting. Greece is proud to co-sponsor, along with like-minded countries, today's event. In this regard, we support any initiative aiming at highlighting the necessity to continue paying close attention to developments in Belarus. After all, we need a broad discussion on how to better handle this critical issue. Since the beginning of the crisis in Belarus, Greece has maintained a clear and consistent position, a position based on values and principles. Together with our partners, we support the obvious right of the people of Belarus to a democratic system of governance. We also strongly condemn the grave human rights violations and the continuous disrespect for the rule of law by the Lukashenka regime. Furthermore, following the forced landing of the Ryanair flight to Minsk on May 23rd, we clearly stated that this was an act not befitting any civilized state. It was an act of state piracy. Greece is looking further into this matter, including on whether anything more can be done as a response. We have actively supported all decisions taken by the European Union to step up pressure on the regime and to increase support for the people of Belarus. I had the chance to meet several times with the leader of the Belarusian opposition, Ms. Tsikhanovskaya, including in Athens. In our discussions, I have reiterated our country's full support for a democratic Belarus. However, despite our common efforts, the Lukashenko regime has shown no intention of changing its behaviour. On the contrary, it has adopted practices to exert pressure on certain member states and the European Union as a whole. Practices as the instrumentalization of refugees and migrants in order to force us to change our policy. We should not let this happen. It is essential that we continue to implement a policy based on values and principles and increase pressure on Lukashenko, including through further actions. At the same time, we should not lose sight of the fact that the instrumentalization of refugees and migrants is being widely practiced by the other states too. In this vein, the necessity to respond to them in a comprehensive and collective way becomes evident. Allow me to conclude by congratulating once again the organizers of today's important event. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Poland. Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Przydacz.
Distinguished ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank Her Excellency Madam Eva Maria Limec and other co-sponsors for organizing this timely and important debate. Since the fraudulent presidential elections over a year ago, we have been witnessing brutal persecutions by Belarusian authorities on an unprecedented scale. Human rights defenders, dissidents, civil society activists, journalists, members of national minorities are subject to widespread and systematic repressions and harassment. Raids, searches, and attacks against civil society organizations, independent media outlets, or journalist associations have become a harsh reality. The regime resorts to cynical and unlawful methods. Post-emergency landing of an aircraft in Minsk on May 23rd this year, resulting in the arrest of the blogger Roman Protasevich, is a telling example. Another one is recent crisis on Belarusian EU border. Minsk regime is taking advantage of the migrants from third countries to increase pressure on EU borders and destabilize the region. Belarusian authorities have been encouraging vulnerable third countries nationals to Belarus and accommodating them in state-owned hotels. Then security services have been bringing them near to the EU Belarusian border. According to many testimonies of migrants caught in Poland, on their way to the Polish border, they are forced to pay bribes, their documents are taken away, and sometimes, finally, they are forced to illegally cross the border into the EU countries. The situation is to become more dramatic with the onset of winter in Europe. These actions by Minsk regime go hand in hand with orchestrated disinformation aimed at showing divisions and escalating tensions. Such a behavior by the Belarusian authorities is both illegal and inhuman. Ladies and gentlemen, we call on the Belarusian authorities to stop human rights violations and bring the perpetrators to justice. we urge Belarus to immediately release Maria Kalashnikova, Maxim Znak, Ales Bialacki, Valentin Stefanovich, Angelika Borys, Andrzej Poczobut, Katerina Andreeva, Daria Chultsova, Raman Pratasevich, as well as the rest of the total of about 700 political prisoners. Ladies and gentlemen, Poland is glad to see a new mechanism under the UN auspices created earlier this year by the Human Rights Council resolution to examine all human rights violations in Belarus. I believe it will contribute to restoring justice to victims of human rights violations and abuses, along with the mandate of the country's special rapporteur. Poland will always stand with the people of Belarus. We will not cease supporting them until a peaceful and democratic solution is attained. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. The next speaker is United Kingdom, Minister of Europe and Americas, Her Excellency Ms. Morton.
Thank you. I'm grateful to our Estonian friends for bringing us together and keeping the spotlight on Lukashenko's regime, which continues to crush freedoms and violate human rights. These rights and freedoms are the cornerstones of an open, democratic society, the kind of society that Belarusians dream of and deserve. But more than a year since the fraudulent presidential election, the regime continues to show little regard for these fundamental rights. Ordinary Belarusians who challenged the election result have been brutally silenced. Individuals have been searched and detained, beaten and tortured. The forced landing of Ryanair flight FR 4978 and the arrest of Roman Protasevich and Sofia Sapieger was particularly shocking. And we are appalled by the lengthy sentences meted out to Maria Kalashnikova and Maxim Znak for daring to propose an alternative future for Belarus. Organisations like Vyasna and the Belarusian Association of Journalists have done extraordinary work to promote and defend human rights in the face of extreme pressure. They have been ruthlessly targeted as a result. To those who have so bravely stood up for freedom and democracy, please know that the UK and our partners here today stand with you. We call for the immediate release and unconditional release of all the political prisoners, more than 800 of them who have been so unjustly detained. Those responsible for their detention and mistreatment must be held to account. We also call on Belarus to cease its use of migrant flows to put pressure on neighbouring countries. Latvia, Lithuania and Poland have seen an influx of migrants arrive via Belarus in recent months, and Estonia is rightly concerned about the security of its border. This harmful, aggressive and exploitative behaviour from Belarus must stop. We continue to work alongside our international partners to ensure a strong, coordinated response to the actions of the Lukashenko regime, including through sanctions designations. The Belarusian people deserve the right to decide their own future, and we will always stand shoulder to shoulder with them. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Romania, State Secretary for Strategic Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Nicolaescu.
Minister Limets, Excellency, speakers, we gather today in a new area meeting to discuss the situation of the human rights in Belarus, as unfortunately, things are only getting worse. Since February 2021, the Lukashenko regime carried out a nationwide crackdown on opposition figures and journalists and started an intimidation campaign in an attempt to suppress the Belarusian vibrant civil society. I would like to thank Estonia for organizing this area meeting, which Romania is co-sponsoring. Let me take this opportunity to express support for the efforts of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Pavel Atushko in voicing the will of freedom and democratic values of the people of Belarus. Any political dialogue in Belarus that does not directly engage the leaders of the legitimate opposition is not a real process of national reconciliation. Last year, almost 500 journalists were detained and almost 30 of them remain behind the bars. According to the Belarusian Association of Journalists, the newsrooms and journalists' homes were raided. Journalists were arrested and charged with different accusations, and the access to news websites was blocked. At least 60 journalists were subject to torture or mistreatment. This system of repression has been imposed with the only aim of silencing journalists and stifling access to opinions that are alternative to the official ones. The convictions of journalists on chopped-up charges adds up to the worrying trend of drastically narrowing, even closing the public space. Planned legal changes will recast criminal and labor law, as well as laws defining extremism, and would make almost any criticism of the government illegal. Moreover, will subject those engaged in this criticism to severe punishment. The regime is clearly seeking to suppress civil society and undermine its capacity to express its political preferences. Ladies and gentlemen, since the beginning of the current crisis in Belarus, we did and we will continue to support the legitimate aspirations of the Belarusian people for freedom and democracy. We will continue to condemn the reprisals against representatives of the opposition and peaceful protesters, as well as the arrests of journalists. Romania already contributed to the European Endowment for Democracy project in support of independent media and civil society in Belarus, and we are considering a new contribution. Also, Romania is implementing the project of granting 100 scholarships to Belarusian students. I also welcome once again the launching of the International Accountability Platform for Belarus in March 2021, to which Romania provided also a financial contribution. But more needs to be done by all of us in order to respond to the expectations of the Belarusian people. The world community needs, in fact, to properly put at work all the tools it has developed to support human rights and fundamental freedoms. I also take this opportunity to once again condemn Lukashenko's regime's weaponization of the illegal immigration by using vulnerable people to reach political objectives. This adds to the Belarusian regime gestures of violation of human rights and international law. Romania expressed solidarity with Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland affected by the illegal immigration instrumented by Minsk, and support appropriate sanctions within the EU framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Slovakia, Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Gorchok.
Madam Chair, thank you and fellow co-sponsors for organizing this important meeting. I would also like to express gratitude to all the briefers for their insightful contributions. In a short time span, less than a year and a half, we have been discussing developments in Belarus within the Arria formula meeting for the third time already. And rightly so, because the situation in the country continues to be rather appalling. More than 400 days have passed since the fraudulent presidential elections took place, yet the Lukashenko regime is all the more repressive and cynical. The figures outlined in the presented concept note are alarming. And it is important to realize, and I can assure you that we do, that behind these numbers are the lives and fates of the Belarusian people. It is a traumatic experience, not only for their families, but also for the whole pro-democratic Belarusian society. Madam Chair, I would like to make 3 brief points. First, current regime proves that it does not shy away from sacrificing the future of this country. It is crucial not to step back and stay consistent in our pressure on Lukashenko and his henchmen. Second, the EU endorsed a number of sanctions packages on Belarus, including the sectoral sanctions. This is one of the tools we have at our disposal. The sanctions, even though not being the panacea, are well designed and they do bite. The hysterical reaction of the regime speaks for itself. as it pulled out the weapon of migration from its toolbox, trying to intimidate the EU countries and to drive wedges amongst us. We strongly condemn the instrumentalization of migrants and refugees by the Belarusian regime. It is crucial not to give in to such tricks and stay united. Third, it is crucial, therefore, that all our steps towards Belarus are matched with a systematic strategic communication. Our effort will not go into vain when we will continue to remind ourselves and Belarusian citizens that freedom and democracy are not the privilege of the few, but the universal right of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Albania, Deputy Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Her Excellency Ms. Fino.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Mr. Minister Limets, for giving me the floor. Albania has co-sponsored this timely event, and I would like to thank Estonia and the other members of the Security Council for making it happen. I would also like to extend my appreciation to all those who joined, distinguished ministers, ambassadors, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, representatives of civil society, dear participants. At the outset, let me thank the briefers for their insightful, well-documented and impartial presentations. What they shared with us today has been witnessed for more than a year by the people of Belarus who have suffered from Lukashenka's regime. It seems like there is no hope for the regime in Minsk to show respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for its own people, or to refrain from diversifying acts of transnational repression, putting in very serious risk the safety and security of millions of innocent people in multiple ways. Madam Chairwoman, last week, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the well-known Belarusian human rights activist and exiled opposition leader, visited Albania. Her situation is a clear testimony that there is no life without fear in Belarus. The regime in Minsk is trying to annihilate the freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and the spirit of democracy for the people in the streets, at homes, in prisons, and all over the country. It is also seriously undermining human security through torturing and punishing by imprisonment, forced exile, intimidation, and abuse of innocent people. The previous speakers mentioned the shocking reports on extreme human rights abuses, use of sexual violence, and attempts that undignifies ordinary people by Lukashenko's mechanisms. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has put at our disposal appalling information that is cause for serious concern. Dear colleagues, the humanitarian crisis always aggravates conflicts and post-conflict situations. Albania shares the concern of the EU with regard to the migratory crisis caused by the Minsk regime. The recent vote of the Belarusian parliament on suspending the readmission agreement with the EU of migrants crossing its territory into the European Union accelerates the deterioration of the situation. Using human beings in need to advance political goals violates human rights and undermines people's life and security. Therefore, the instrumentalization of migrants and refugees is unacceptable. Dear participants, last year, while the democracy crisis in Belarus was proliferating, the Prime Minister of Albania, in his capacity of the chairperson in office of the OSCE, together with the Swedish successor in OSCE, offered to Belarus to facilitate the dialogue. The answer to the offer was paused. Instead, all the following events in the country have been accompanied by a disinformation and a propaganda campaign by Belarus authorities and state media to misinform its people. To this end, I would like to praise the irreplaceable role of human rights defenders, political prisoners, journalists and media workers, civil society representatives, and all those that are very actively fighting for the protection of democracy, respect for human rights, and fundamental freedoms in Belarus. As an elected non-permanent member of the Security Council, Albania has placed the promotion and respect for human rights at the top of its priorities. Together with all our partners concerned, we will keep a close eye on the human rights situation in Belarus, and will do our best to make and keep this matter on the Security Council agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Czech Republic, Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Kulhanek.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and well, thank you for organizing this timely meeting. And also, let me thank all the distinguished briefers for their comprehensive and first-hand take on the latest developments in Belarus. The situation in the country is indeed a gloomy one. More than a year after the fraudulent presidential elections, I'm quite deeply concerned about the systematic human rights violations, massive repression and intimidation campaign against civil society and independent media in Belarus. And it seems that the situation might continue to deteriorate further. Lawlessness has prevailed in Belarus. As we speak, thousands of people are facing harassment, illegal persecution, and arrests purely for political reasons. There are credible reports of severe abuse of detainees and their particularly cruel treatment. Well documented are cases of torture of political prisoners and activists. There must be no impunity for the perpetrators. All those who were unlawfully detained must be released. The number of political prisoners has reached more than 700, and it is growing by the day. Political opposition is being labeled as terrorists. Attacks continue against leading human rights organizations in Belarus, such as Viesna, the Legal Initiative, and the Belarusian Helsinki Committee, to name just a few. A systematic campaign against the independent media has the clear aim of suffocating all free voices in Belarus. All this makes us extremely concerned, and we are quite appalled. We support an independent international investigation of all atrocities. And this investigation should be conducted by all the appropriate mechanisms, including through the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. Belarusian authorities must fully cooperate with the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. We also strongly condemn the regime's weaponization of migrants for political purposes and urge the authorities to stop this practice. This is simply unacceptable, and it has to stop. Ladies and gentlemen, let me mention one Belarusian citizen in particular, and that is Ihar Losik, a social media consultant of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He's 29, and he has a 2-year-old daughter, Pauline, and has been detained for 16 months. He has been on a number of hunger strikes in prison. The Czech Republic calls for his immediate and unconditional release, as well as for the release of all those arbitrarily detained. The Czech Republic continues to support the struggle of the Belarusians for democracy and fundamental rights. Over the past 2 years, we have further strengthened our bilateral financial support for the independent media, civil society, and people in need in Belarus. Madam Chair, Belarus must fully address all these issues, in particular, those related to the gross human rights violation, and to refrain from any further harassment of their own citizens. Belarusian authorities must fully comply with all their international obligations and commitments in this regard. A thorough, transparent, and impartial investigation of all attacks must be conducted. In closing, I would like to mention the jailed artist and politician Maria Kalashnikova, who was awarded the annual Václav Havel Human Rights Award by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe this year. She's serving the sentence of 11-year imprisonment for leading demonstrations against Lukashenko. At the ceremony, she was represented by her sister. And please let me quote her wise and yet quite sobering words. If we don't want Belarus to turn into one giant prison, we must support the Belarusian people today and now. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ukraine. First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Her Excellency Mr. Japarov.
Thank you, dear Minister Limets, dear colleagues. I thank Estonia for organizing today's timely event and the briefers for their valuable first-hand insights. I think that we should pay particular attention to the human rights violations in Belarus and threats for the peace and security in Eastern Europe brought by those violations. To say that we are alarmed is to say nothing. Ukraine is consistent in its commitments to develop good neighborly relations with the Republic of Belarus based on democratic values and mutual respect. Unfortunately, last year's fraudulent presidential elections in Belarus were followed by aggressive behavior of illegitimate Belarusian authorities against its neighboring countries, in particular Ukraine. Moreover, Russia has immediately seized this opportunity to increase its political and military influence on Belarus. Kremlin's revanchist political agenda would not accept a sovereign and independent Belarus, which Russia considers an indispensable part of its so-called Russian world. The latest example is a recent adoption of 28 union programs between Russia and self-proclaimed Belarusian authorities, which took place on the eve of elections to the Russian parliament. The ongoing Anschluss of Belarus leads to its transformation into a new Russian military base aimed at further destabilization of Europe, similar to the one built in the Russia-occupied Ukrainian Crimea. Madam Chair, by these actions, Lukashenko's regime undermines not only the statehood and sovereignty of Belarus, but the security of the entire region as well. In this context of particular concern are the Kremlin's plans to deploy Russian air and missile bases in Belarus and to increase sharply their bilateral military technical cooperation. Such militarization of Belarus is a direct threat not only to Ukraine, but also to the entire Eastern and Central Europe. Let me recall in this vein the most recent military exercises, Zapad 2021. The military transparency and strategic stability were put under question as Russia, like in many other cases of large-scale military exercises, manipulated on the true number of involved participants and true scenarios of the exercises. Those security challenges are coupled by Russia-guided instrumentalization by Belarus of human rights and human beings for political purposes, disinformation and propaganda campaign. We express our solidarity with Lithuania and Poland, which suffer most from migrants' crisis on their borders, artificially created by Lukashenko's regime. We condemn such policy and urge Belarus to stop it. We are also seriously concerned by the ongoing campaign of political repressions in Belarus, which only intensifies, and many of the speakers have already mentioned about those violations and persecutions. The citizens of Ukraine have also become its victims, unfortunately, and of course we will continue to protect and our efforts to release illegally detained Ukrainian citizens and protect their rights. We hope that the gravity of these threats will urge Western countries to take new decisive actions against Russia to prevent it from further absorbing Belarus. Along with the European partners, Ukraine stands ready to assist Belarus in overcoming political crisis and ultimately regain its sovereignty and continue to stand in solidarity with Belarusian people and provide assistance to those of them who flee to Ukraine from Lukashenko regime, and we have already sheltered thousands of those. In conclusions, let me stress it again. It is extremely important for Ukraine and the whole Europe that Belarus remains a sovereign and independent country. It's probable that further integration with Russia would lead only to new challenges and threats in Europe. We should continue working together to counter the Russian Federation takeover of Belarus. Democratic developments in Belarus are vital and I think inevitable for the sake of its own citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm glad to hand over to our Deputy Foreign Minister, Mr. Rein Tammsaar, who will continue to moderate the meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Minister. Let us continue with representatives of co-sponsors. I would now like to give the floor to Australia. Permanent Representative, His Excellency Ms. Fifield. Mr. Fifield, sorry.
Indeed, Minister, and can I thank Estonia for bringing this important situation to the attention of the Security Council. Its relevance to international peace and security is demonstrated by the large number of co-sponsors for today's Arria formula meeting, of which Australia is pleased to be one. I'd also like to thank the briefers for their very important first-hand testimony. Australia is deeply concerned by the unprecedented escalation of human rights violations in Belarus, including the continuous infringements on the rights to freedom of opinion and expression, assembly and association. Australia observed with dismay the mounting repression in the run-up to the aftermath of the presidential election held on 9 August 2020, which included the systematic denial of human rights and fundamental freedoms, arbitrary arrests and detention of opposition members, journalists and media workers, human rights defenders and citizens for exercising their fundamental freedoms. Australia urges the government of Belarus to respect the rights and legitimate democratic aspirations of its people. More recently, we've been alarmed by reports of facilitated illegal border crossings from Belarus to neighbouring states as retaliation for firm but legitimate European policies and sanctions in the face of ongoing abuses and repression. Belarusian authorities' crude instrumentalisation of vulnerable people for political purposes magnifies the regime's worsening image abroad and its human rights record. We call on Belarus to end violence against its citizens, to free imprisoned members of the opposition, peaceful protesters and members of the public detained by security forces. And we urge the Belarusian authorities to engage in a genuine, constructive and inclusive dialogue with those representing civil society. Australia also looks forward to the outcome of the International Civil Aviation Organisation fact-finding investigation into events surrounding Ryanair FR 4978. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Ireland. Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Ms. Byrne Nason, please.
It's Ambassador Kelly, actually. Thank you, Minister, and thank you to Estonia for hosting today's meeting. Excellencies, Ireland co-sponsored today's meeting out of our grave concern for the appalling human rights abuses in Belarus. Our briefers this morning have highlighted the stark reality on the ground, with Lukashenko's rule imposed through fear and intimidation and the deployment of widespread state violence against the Belarusian people. Despite repeated calls from the international community and the imposition of targeted sanctions by the EU and other partners, we've seen no end to this repression. Ireland unreservedly condemns these violations and calls for their immediate cessation. Of particular concern is the arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances of human rights defenders. We call for their immediate and unconditional release. freedom of expression also remains severely curtailed. We must continue to press the Belarusian authorities to respect this fundamental freedom and to insist unequivocally on the protection of the Belarusian people's human rights. I want to pay tribute to the many women who have participated in and led peaceful protests and civic actions in defence of democratic principles and their human rights. Their courage and determination fills us with hope for the future of Belarus. We are deeply troubled by the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which refers to numerous accounts of women being violently arrested by security forces, beaten, tortured, and subjected to sexual violence and verbal abuse. This must stop now, and the perpetrators of such horrendous acts must be held to account. We have also seen the Belarusian authorities orchestrate the flow of vulnerable migrants, including young children, across its borders into neighbouring countries. To manipulate migration in this way shows a disregard for the human rights of migrants, with the destabilising effects of this deliberate policy felt across the region. In the face of such actions, it is incumbent on us all to ensure that our international protection commitments and obligations are fully upheld. To conclude, Chair, I want to assure you of Ireland's steadfast support for a sustainable, democratic and peaceful resolution of the situation in Belarus. It is for the Belarusian people alone to decide the future of their country. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Netherlands. Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Ms. Brandt, please.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, and let me start by thanking also all the briefers for their excellent presentations. On behalf of Minister Ben Knapen, I would like to thank the members of the Security Council and Estonia in particular for taking the initiative for this meeting. Today we are gathered in the third Arria formula session on Belarus since the fraudulent presidential elections of August 2020. The worsening human rights situation is nothing short of tragic for the people of Belarus. First of all, we can see that the regime is cracking down even more harshly on virtually all aspects of civil society activity in Belarus. Hundreds of organizations have been forced to close. Thousands of activists have had to flee the country or are in detention. And we just heard that the number of political prisoners, as well as the reports of torture and ill treatment of detainees, continue to rise. The reputable Belarusian human rights organization Vyasna reports more than 700 political prisoners. As just pointed out, this includes Vyasna's own chairman, Ales Bielatsky, who is also vice president of the International Federation for Human Rights. This total repression of peaceful civil society organizations is unacceptable. The criminal justice system in Belarus is increasingly being misused and transformed into an instrument of state repression through legislative changes and arbitrary prosecutions and convictions. Belarus must halt these practices immediately and fully adhere to its commitments under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention Against Torture. I would also like to address the issue of the use of migrants for political purposes by the Belarusian authorities. This unacceptable practice treats people as political tools and puts them in danger. It must end immediately. Mr. Chair, I would like to conclude by underlining the Netherlands' support for the Belarusian people's right to determine their own future through free and fair elections. And like others, we call urgently upon the government of Belarus to respect human rights and in particular to immediately and unconditionally release all political prisoners, put an end to all the violence and harassment, in particular against journalists, members of civil society and the democratic opposition, cooperate with all efforts to ensure accountability for violations of human rights in the country, and halt the instrumentalization of migration for political purposes. Finally, the Netherlands calls on all UN member states to refrain from providing any support to the Belarusian regime's repression and human rights violations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Italy, Deputy Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Stefanila. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Many thanks to Estonia for convening this meeting, which we convincingly co-sponsored, and our appreciation goes also to the briefers for their interventions. Let me also express our support for the statement that will be made by the Deputy Secretary General of the European External Action Service. The situation in Belarus continues to be a source of concern. Italy, along with its partners, has condemned the repression against those who have been peacefully voicing their protest after the elections of August 2020 that lacked any democratic legitimacy due to numerous manipulations and irregularities. Such disturbing situation remains unresolved, and repression on human rights defenders, journalists, and other media workers, as well as on political opponents and civil society organizations, is continuing with impunity. The forced diversion and landing of Ryanair Flight 4978 jeopardized international civil aviation safety and showed flagrant disregard for international norms. More recently, Belarusian authorities have manipulated migration flows to take advantage of vulnerable citizens from third countries, fueling illegal border crossings from Belarus to neighbouring states. Italy condemns the instrumentalization of human flows for political purposes with the objective of destabilizing neighbouring countries and diverting attention from increasing human rights violations. It is also deplorable that the Belarus authorities and state media are sponsoring disinformation and propaganda campaigns to discredit European Union member states and to provoke more tension in the neighbourhood. We once again urge the government of Belarus to follow a path of dialogue with the opposition forces, to release all political detainees, and to work for some form of genuine political transition towards the ultimate objective of free and fair elections. In this regard, we are ready to support a possible OSCE mediation role, which would guarantee impartiality as well as the respect of Belarus' independence and sovereignty. Full implementation of the Benedek report would also be desirable. The current crisis in Belarus is first and foremost about Belarus citizens and their legitimate aspirations. Anybody willing to paint it as the result of a geopolitical competition is simply missing the point, or worse, is trying to alter the facts. In the context that I'm describing, all influent international actors are invited to play a constructive role to foster a genuine and inclusive political dialogue in Belarus. Our common objectives should be to support the Belarusian people in this plight and facilitate a peaceful resolution through a meaningful dialogue between the government and all the opposition forces. It is not up to us to say what shape this dialogue should take, as long as it is genuine and inclusive. And this is our renewed appeal to the Belarusian leadership. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Bulgaria. Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Ms. Stoeva. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me start by expressing appreciation to Estonia for organizing today's meeting, which Bulgaria has also co-sponsored. It could not have been more timely in view of the recent worrisome developments. I would like to thank the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights as well as the briefers for their very insightful and sobering presentations. Bulgaria is deeply concerned by the deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus, the continuing repressions of the Belarusian authorities against political opponents, independent media, and civil society organizations. Equally alarming are the intensifying acts of transnational repression, the weaponization of migration, and its use as a tool for exerting pressure on neighboring states and for destabilizing the region. The forced and unlawful landing of Ryanair Flight 4978 in Minsk on 23rd of May 2021, widely condemned by the international community, was yet another demonstration of the flagrant disregard of the Lukashenko regime for the international law and international norms. The Belarusian citizens continue to be denied the right of freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. There are well-documented cases of systemic, widespread, and gross human rights violations in Belarus. arbitrary arrests and lack of fair trial, cases of torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment and punishment, recent legislative changes which have further institutionalized impunity of the security forces are a matter of profound concern and cannot be tolerated. It is of vital importance to ensure accountability for perpetrated human rights violations and abuses. Bulgaria stands in solidarity with the democratic aspirations of the Belarusian people and calls for an end to the persecution of representatives of civil society and the media and for the unconditional release of arbitrarily detained persons. We urge the Belarusian authorities to respect the principles of democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, and to initiate a genuine and inclusive dialogue with the wider Belarusian society, including the political opposition and the civil society. The only way to end the political crisis is through an inclusive national dialogue resulting in free and fair elections under the observation of the OSCE. Finally, we strongly urge the Belarusian authorities to comply with their obligations under international law and to stop the attempts of destabilization of the neighborhood through cynical exploitation of unregulated migration and launch disinformation campaigns. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to France. Deputy Political Coordinator, Mr. Benabou, please. The floor is yours. Please unmute. Please unmute your mic. The floor is yours, please. Mr. Benabou, the floor is yours, please. Please, the floor is yours. Next speaker, let's try again. Mr. Benabou, the floor is yours, please.
Ministers, Excellencies, dear representatives of the civil society, I thank Estonia for the organization of this meeting and the briefers for their remarks. Since the start of the political crisis in Belarus more than a year ago, the regime of Alyaksandr Lukashenka has conducted a violent crackdown on the pro-democracy protest movement in Belarus. The Belarusian authorities have demonstrated unprecedented brutality with the continuing arrests and convictions of political opponents, journalists, and media workers, researchers, civil society representatives, and human rights defenders, the closure of all independent media, the forced landing of a civilian flight on May 23rd, and the instrumentalization of the Migrants' flight in an attempt to destabilize neighbouring countries. The peaceful protests in Belarus that began in August 2020 were not about geopolitics, but about election fraud. What we have witnessed since then shows clearly how disregard for the rule of law can lead to a spiral of violence and repression with direct consequences for regional security and stability. In response to this crisis, the European Union and its member states have adopted several sets of targeted sanctions against individuals and entities involved in the repression. These sanctions are aimed at those directly responsible for the human rights violations and seek to spare the Belarusian people. We strengthened them again last year. In parallel, France maintained a constant support and dialogue with the Belarusian democratic opposition, as well as with all components of Belarusian civil society. Our authorities have received both Pavel Latushka and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in Paris, and we have increased our support to Belarusian students forced into exile. We continue to demand the immediate and unconditional release of all those arbitrarily detained in Belarus. We do not recognize the irregular election of Alyaksandr Lukashenka, and we denounce his blind policy of repression. We will continue to support the Belarusian people in their democratic aspirations and to call on the Belarusian authorities to uphold their international commitments with respect to human rights and fundamental freedoms. We reiterate France's hope that a national dialogue can be established in Belarus, leading to free and fair elections under international supervision. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Japan, Mr. Hiroaki, Counselor of Permanent Mission of Japan. Please, floor is yours. Next speaker is Japan. Please, the floor is yours. Please unmute your mic.
I thank the Republic of Estonia for convening this important meeting. I also thank the briefers for the inputs. Japan is deeply concerned about the ongoing political and human rights crisis in Belarus. It is extremely regrettable that, despite the appeals from the international community, including Japan, the Belarusian authorities have not stopped the arbitrary detention of its students, and is continuing to act against the principles of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Japan strongly condemns the forced landing of the Lion Air Flight 4978 in Minsk on May 23rd, and the subsequent detainment of the journalist, Mr. Roman Protasevich. It is unjustifiable that the Belarusian authorities detained a specific passenger flying on a civil aircraft, which was forced to make an emergency landing. I also must refer to a regrettable incident that occurred this summer during the Olympic Games Tokyo 2020, which is a festival of peace. A Belarusian Olympic athlete, Ms. Kristina Chimanovskaya, faced forcible return to her country against her will, under pressure from the authorities of Belarus due to the expression of her personal views on the competition. This is simply wrong and unacceptable. Japan has worked with relevant organizations taking into account international human rights norms and placed the utmost priority on her safety, her safe transfer to the destination, and the protection of her basic human rights from abuse. Japan once again strongly urges the Belarusian authorities to cease arbitrary detention and forceful oppression of its students, and to engage in national dialogue that respects the rule of law and democracy. We look forward to working closely with the international community to this end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Belgium, Deputy Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Lagatti. Please.
Thank you. I would like to thank Estonia for organizing this important meeting, as well as the briefers for sharing their insights with us. 1 year after the fraudulent elections in Belarus, the situation on the ground remains extremely worrisome. We deplore the continuous blatant disrespect by the Lukashenko regime of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Belarusian people. These violations include arbitrary arrest and detention, torture, and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, including sexual and gender-based violence. We reiterate our demand for the unconditional and immediate release of all arbitrarily detained persons, including many political prisoners. The Belarusian authorities must provide an enabling environment for journalists and media workers, including international journalists, as well as civil society, human rights defenders, and NGOs. 1 year ago, Belgium was one of the 17 OSCE participating member states invoking the OSCE Moscow mechanism. One of the recommendations of the report of Mr. Benedek, rapporteur under the OSCE Moscow mechanism, stated that it is vital to ensure accountability for the human rights violations in the context of the presidential elections. In this regard, I would like to reaffirm Belgium's full support for the international initiatives to hold all perpetrators accountable, especially the OHCHR examination and accountability mechanism on Belarus and the International Accountability Platform for Belarus, to which Belgium is partner. We call on all stakeholders to fully and unconditionally cooperate with these initiatives. We cannot allow a culture of impunity to take root. Furthermore, we reiterate our call for full cooperation with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. A democratic transition which would allow Belarusian citizens to shape their future, the future they want for their country, requires the full respect of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Belarusian citizens. As a member of the European Union and of the OSCE, Belgium will continue to raise the issue of human rights situation in all relevant international fora, and will remain steadfast in our support for a democratic, independent, sovereign, prosperous and stable Belarus. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to United States of America. Deputy Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Mills. Please, floor is yours.
Let me begin by thanking the Assistant Secretary General for her remarks today on the concerning human rights situation in Belarus. We also thank the other presenters for their valuable insights into what is a deeply unsettling situation. It has been more than a year since the fraudulent presidential election in Belarus. It has been over a year since the Lukashenko regime embarked on its campaign of brutal repression against the people of Belarus. As we heard today, the regime's repression not only affects the people of Belarus, but also transcends borders. Since the Security Council last discussed this issue in May, we've seen a disturbing rise in the regime's willingness to repress not only its own citizens, but also to reach beyond its borders, to use the same tactics to intimidate and threaten Belarusians who have sought refuge outside of Belarus. The United States condemns the Lukashenko regime's violent crackdown against civil society. We will continue to stand with our allies and our partners to demand accountability for those who commit abuses and those who craft, order, implement, or support any actions which undermine the democratic aspirations of the Belarusian people. This includes the detention of more than 700 political prisoners, the shutting of scores of civil society institutions, and cowardly threats made against the personal safety of democratic leaders forced to live in exile. The forced diversion of the Ryanair flight in order to detain and torture a blogger was an unacceptable act of transnational repression. We welcomed the International Civil Aviation Organization Council decision of May 27th that called on the ICAO Secretariat to conduct a fact-finding investigation. This investigation is underway, and the final report will be presented to the ICAO Council in November, and we wait for it urgently. As long as the regime in Belarus refuses to respect its international obligations and commitments, undermines the peace and security of Europe, and continues to repress and abuse its own people, we will not bend on sanctions, nor will we lessen our calls for accountability. Let me close by again urging the Belarusian authorities to release all political prisoners and call for those in the security services responsible for abuses to be held accountable. We maintain our call for Belarusian authorities to begin a peaceful, inclusive, and constructive dialogue with opposition leaders and Belarusian civil society that is done in a way that respects the aspirations of the Belarusian people. And finally, Belarus should fully implement the recommendations of the OSCE Moscow Mechanism October 2020 fact-finding report on credible reports of human rights violations before, during, and after the August presidential election. In closing, I want to thank the Foreign Minister for hosting this important meeting today, and I want to recognize Estonia's leadership in maintaining the Security Council's focus on the situation in Belarus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Norway, Deputy Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Ms. Heimerback, please.
Thank you, Chair. Norway welcomes the opportunity to discuss the situation in Belarus today, and we thank Estonia for this initiative. We have repeatedly expressed our concern about the worsening situation in Belarus and called on the government to cease their policy of intimidation and harassment of civil society, media workers, and members of the pro-democracy movement. Yet we continue to see people prosecuted and jailed simply for exercising their right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. They should be released immediately. We are dismayed to see the Belarusian regime resort to widespread repression. It is clear that the authorities have chosen violence and repression over dialogue, particularly since last autumn. The regime has intensified its attack on human rights defenders and civil society activists through arbitrary detention, violence against peaceful protesters, including women and youth, and undue restrictions on the rights to freedom of assembly and expression, both on and offline. The number of cases of torture and sexual and gender-based violence also continues to rise. This is unacceptable. Vyazna and the Belarusian Association of Journalists are two of the organizations that have been subject to the government's repressive measures, and the regime's fear of these brave activists is clear for all to see. The crackdown on dissent will only lead to more unrest. It will not solve the political crisis for which we hold the regime fully responsible. Impunity is not an option. Perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses must be brought to justice. Chair, following the forced landing of the passenger plane in Belarus in May, the regime demonstrated that it will not shy away from any means to maintain its grip of power. We will look forward to the Keynote report that will be released later this fall. Chair, moreover, the Belarusian government's active facilitation of migration flows across borders with Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia raises serious questions about its commitments to regional stability and relations with its neighbors. Let me end by calling again on the Belarusian regime to release all political prisoners, cease its attack on civil society and human rights defenders, and engage in a genuine dialogue with pro-democracy forces in the country. This can be the only path forward. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Germany. Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Ms. Lendertse. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Foreign Minister Limets, for convening this meeting on the situation in Belarus, which is a cause of serious concern. It has been more than a year now since the 2020 elections. They were neither free or fair, and had, as a consequence, the Belarusian people were deprived of their basic and fundamental democratic rights. The political crisis in Belarus goes on and on. Systematic repression, threats, and violence continue unabatedly. The regime has stabilized its power through fear, massive repression, and through the unscrupulous support from Moscow. A constantly growing numbers of political detainees, now more than 670, languish in the regime's prisons, and tens of thousands of Belarusians had to leave their home country. They are fleeing from persecution and a growing sense of despair in a country where the government treats its own people as if they were enemies. We therefore call for the immediate release of all unlawfully detained people. This includes Maria Kalashnikova and Maxim Znak, both of whom have been convicted to lengthy sentences on spurious charges. In fact, they are political prisoners, and their imprisonment is a mockery of the rule of law. Equally shocking is the forced diversion of an international flight in order to arrest journalist Roman Protasevich and his partner. This irresponsible and deplorable act put 132 passengers and crew members at risk. This is another violation of international law. Sadly, the regime's repression against its own people is just one example of how Minsk abuses ordinary people for its political ends. The regime also plays a cynical game and endangers refugees and migrants by trafficking them across the border with the EU in order to put pressure on neighbouring countries. This orchestrated campaign has already resulted in several deaths on the border. We are convinced that the Human Rights Council, as well as the Security Council, needs to continue to shine a spotlight on the situation in Belarus. As far as the Human Rights Council is concerned, the work of the Special Rapporteur on Belarus is indispensable in this regard. And the same is true of the International Accountability Platform on Belarus that Germany is proud to support. The European Union has reacted firmly and speedily by imposing measures on those responsible. Our message is clear. We are going after the perpetrators while standing by the Belarusian people. To be clear, the people of Belarus are not targeted by these measures. Additionally, the German government has launched an action plan, Civil Society Belarus. Amongst others, victims of torture and detainees and those seeking to flee from political persecution were supported and will be supported by these measures. While these measures address some effects of the persisting crackdown in Belarus, it remains clear that there is only one sustainable solution to the crisis, and it is simple and straightforward. I urge the Belarusian authorities to finally engage with and listen to their own people and to heed the aspirations of the people to democracy and human rights. We call on Minsk to start a genuine and inclusive national dialogue and to engage with the OSCE. The OSCE stands ready to assist in finding a way out of the impasse. Germany will continue to stand with the people of Belarus in these times of crisis and will support them where possible to restore their democratic rights. I thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much. Allow me now to invite the representatives of the Security Council members to take the floor. The next speaker is Russian Federation. First, Deputy Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Polyansky. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, please.
Dear colleagues, upon the initiative of our Estonian friends, we participate today at an event devoted to a country-specific situation, which is not on the agenda of Security Council. I want to note from the outset that it's regrettable that our colleagues in Tallinn, on the eve of leaving the Council, still haven't learned that Arria formulas, being its informal gatherings, are supposed to be devoted to the issues which fall within the purview of responsibility of the Council. Since we gathered here anyway, we believe that it could be a good opportunity to raise the issues of concern in Baltic Black Sea region, which we usually don't discuss in the Security Council. I have to confess that the situation in this area has been extremely worrying for more than 3 decades already, and old issues are unfortunately being overshadowed by new ones. But let's start with a little quiz to find out how well do we know the countries in question. Can you name me a country where 10% of the population, or almost 200,000 persons, are being for 30 years deprived of citizenship and major political rights? This is Latvia, a home country for our today's keynote speaker, Ms. Ilze Brand-Keris, who was passionately teaching our Belarusian neighbors today how they should govern their country. From such a perspective, these lessons seem unconvincing, especially if we add to this picture blatant discrimination of Russian speakers in this country in the field of education. Despite the fact that 88% of Russian speakers wish to continue education of their children in Russian, they are virtually deprived of such opportunity. Do you think that I am exaggerating? Do you believe that Latvian society is friendly and inclusive for Russian speakers who have lived there hundreds of years? I will give you only one recent example which will help you to understand the real scope of this problem. Just several days ago, one Latvian member of parliament, Karina Sprude, commenting in her Twitter on the information that the number of COVID-19 cases among Russian-speaking population in Latvia is much higher than among Latvian speakers, wondered why there are no advertisements or instructions on vaccination in Russian language in her country. She apparently believed that it would help to decrease the number of cases. And there came an answer from another public figure, a well-known activist and assistant of a member of Latvian parliament, Maris Michereviskis, whose name is Selma Leverens. I quote, "The more Russians will die, the better it is for the Latvian language." I will show you the screenshot. Yes, like this. This example of apparent hate speech has caused predictable indignation of Russian-speaking population in Latvia, but received absolutely no attention in European Union. We didn't hear anything from Ms. Brand-Keris, who is ASG for human rights. And we are not surprised. It's much easier to teach others how they should live than to do obvious homework at home. One might say that Latvia is an outstanding, disgraceful case in the Baltic Black Sea region, but unfortunately facts don't sustain this claim. Neighbouring Estonia, the organizer of today's event, carries out same policies towards 8% of its no-citizens population. The verbal attack on Russian speakers there are not less frequent than in Latvia, and they persist for 3 decades already. They are not only verbal. Dozens of Russian-speaking activists, who, by the way, are identifying themselves with Estonia and Latvia and not with Russia, are arrested, jailed, and prosecuted only because they fight for their basic civil and political rights, for better future for their children in the country to which they historically belong, and for their Russian national identity. No one would question their right to preserve it, be it not in Latvia or Estonia. And to make this picture even gloomier, let's not forget about flagrant war on media freedom that is being waged by Latvia, Estonia, and their neighbor Lithuania for decades. The facts are so numerous that for time-saving reasons, I will not give specific cases or statistics here. You will easily find them in a lot of documents. For instance, in the recent report of the Foreign Ministry of Russia on human rights situation in the world. There are a lot of letters and appeals piling up in relevant European institutions on these cases. But I don't think we will ever hear a reaction from them. Our EU colleagues' attention is focused only on Russia and, as of recently, on Belarus, and they are ready to forgive everything to their fellow EU members. Needless to say that such a situation considerably devaluates any claim by the EU to be at the forefront of the struggle for human rights. Unfortunately, this complacency and obvious double standards have not only damaged EU image in the world, but also already resulted in a metastasis in the same Baltic Black Sea region. I am having in mind Ukraine, aka anti-Russia, since illegal Western-sponsored Maidan coup in 2014. The hate speech, persecution of Russian speakers, and consistent banning of Russian language, which is native to at least 40% of its citizens, have created an extremely explosive and divisive situation in this country, triggered the decision of Crimea to reunify with Russia, and caused continuing civil war in its east, which resulted in more than 13,000 lives. There are dozens of examples of hate speech attributed to modern Ukrainian politicians, in comparison to which the words of Selma Laurens would sound as a child's game. But let me not promote them here out of respect to our Security Council colleagues. A simple internet-relevant search will give you numerous results. Dear colleagues, what also makes Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania common in their perverted attitude towards our recent history, namely making heroes of those who collaborated with Nazis and committed terrible atrocities against Jews, Poles, Ukrainians and Russians during the Second World War. This is not only contradicting obvious historical truths and the outcome of Nuremberg Tribunal, but also antagonizing these societies, pushing even further Russian speakers for whom preservation of memory of those who died liberating USSR and Eastern Europe from fascist aggressors is sacred and non-negotiable. And not only Russian speakers protest against glorification of Nazi collaborators. I have here with me a copy of the book by Silvia Foti, the granddaughter of Lithuanian modern hero Jonas Noreika, a wartime Lithuanian statesman who, as she found out, was perpetrator of the Holocaust in her country. That's the book. She found the courage to speak out and tell the true story of her family. This is only one example, but there are dozens more of those who have become heroes in Kiev, Tallinn, Vilnius and Riga, having on their hands blood of hundreds of thousands of innocent victims. We must have courage to call spade a spade and tell the truth about them, no matter how high they are placed in the pantheon of these countries. Like Silvia Foti did. It's high time to follow her example. And there is one more thing that unites Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania and Ukraine. It's their role in promoting a failed color revolution in their neighboring state, Belarus. Let me also add Poland to this club, which still has some colonial déjà vu when it comes to its former territories. They have been working on this project together with the US and the EU for many years, training protesters, investing money in them, creating sleeping cells, cultivating NGOs, and openly finding Belarusian opposition, then harboring its leaders and calling these imposters elected leaders of Belarus. The EU's Eastern Partnership, which has already played a subversive role in Ukraine, was one of the key channels for such efforts. The stakes were high and the money was considerable, but Belarusians did not let themselves to be tricked. To a large extent, thanks to a tragic example of Ukrainians who allowed extremists and ultranationalists to steal their country from them and govern it with Western money and under de facto Western protectorate. And that's why we're sitting here today listening to the stories of our Baltic, Ukrainian and Western friends on how bad the Belarusian authorities are, which maybe would be more credible if human rights and media freedom would not be violated and even raped in their own countries. Colleagues, it's hard to believe you, given your own background, and I'm sorry if you don't understand this. And your lectures to Belarusians or us on how to organize our societies will never be considered seriously before you end the shameful practice of new apartheid, that is de facto state ideology in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. To conclude, I want to once again come back to the loathsome words by infamous Selma Laurens. I don't know how to pronounce her correctly. I will show you the screenshot of her Twitter page, and you will see the hashtag of the Belarusian protest movement Живе Belarus on it. Here it is. This is not a coincidence. People like Selma see no conflict in supporting protests in Belarus and wishing death to all Russian speakers. And Russian, as you might know, is an official language of Belarus. Because people like her don't want to help Belarusians, they just want their country. Dear Baltic and Western colleagues, I propose to make Selma the symbol of your efforts to topple legitimate Belarusian authorities. I think she deserves this because she openly says what you are up to vis-à-vis your neighbors. Thank you for your attention.
Next speaker is India, Deputy Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Ragottahalli. Please, the floor is yours. The floor is yours, please. Please unmute your mic.
I thank Honorable Deputy Foreign Minister of Estonia for giving me the floor. I'll be brief. We have taken careful note of the points made by the briefers and the panelists. I would like to underscore that any discussion on internal affairs of a sovereign state needs to be objective and based on facts. It is also important to prevent the discussion becoming one-sided by avoiding contrarian views. Moreover, discussions on a country's internal affairs are best avoided until and unless they have a significant regional and international ramification. We note that the situation at present in Belarus remains largely peaceful and stable. India has always advocated political and diplomatic solutions that protect the legitimate interests of all countries in the region and ensure long-term peace and stability in Eurasia and beyond. In conclusion, I wish to clarify that India's relations with countries in the region stands on its own merit. They are not unduly affected by extraneous factors. India continues to have friendly and cordial relations with all countries in the region, including Belarus. I thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Mexico. Political Coordinator, Mr. Ochoa, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Undersecretary. First of all, we'd like to thank Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and other briefers for their presentations. Mexico is extremely concerned by the dire situation that migrants and refugees are facing in Belarus. The individuals fleeing precariousness, prosecution, or conflict are finding themselves stranded at the borders of Belarus and European Union states in a heightened state of vulnerability. The exploitations of persons trapped in this dramatic scenario for political purposes is simply unacceptable and shameful. This grave situation raises important questions concerning human rights violations. We call on the Belarusian authorities and neighboring states to fulfill their obligations regarding international human rights law and refugee law with respect of all migrants, regardless of their status. This is a collective responsibility and a human imperative. Mexico's position is very clear. Migration is not a problem to be solved, but a phenomenon to be managed. The role of international cooperation is to ensure it takes place in a safe, orderly, and regular manner. Mr. Undersecretary, Mexico is also concerned about reports of crackdowns of peaceful protests, freedom of expression, and peaceful assembly. Opposition candidates, human rights defenders, journalists, union leaders, among others, have been arrested, tortured, or forcibly exiled. We call on the Belarusian authorities to follow up on any allegations or denouncements and to ensure accountability in these cases where human rights violations are committed. Bolstering due process and the rule of law and combating impunity through independent investigations is key. Polarization must be countered through inclusive dialogue, not by force. We conclude by calling the authorities to engage in a national dialogue aimed at reaching agreements in pursuit of a peaceful and stable Belarus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to China. Deputy Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Geng. Please, the floor is yours. Please unmute your microphone. Thank you. Please unmute your microphone. Mr. Gang, please unmute your mic. Thank you very much. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Chairman, I listened very carefully to the briefers and the previous speakers. I welcome the attendance of Ambassador Rabakov of Belarus. Chairman, human rights situation in Belarus is in nature the country's internal affairs. Any interference in the internal affairs of Belarus is against the basic principles of international relations, and therefore unacceptable. Constructive dialogue and cooperation is the only right way to promote and protect human rights, while accusation and pressure will do nothing conducive to the settlement of disputes. China respects the development path chosen by the people of Belarus, which suit their national conditions. China supports Belarus' efforts to safeguard its national independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. China firmly opposes the use of unilateral coercive measures or the threat to use such measures in international relations. Mr. Chairman, illegal migration is by no means a new issue to Europe. It requires joint efforts from countries of origin, transit, and destination to tackle this issue. The current migration issue between Belarus and its neighboring countries is no exception. Belarus, as a country of transit and destination, is no less a victim of the illegal migration than its neighbors. At the General Assembly general debate, the Belarusian foreign minister said that Belarus had proposed to the European Union to hold consultations on the issue of illegal migration, but got no reaction. China hopes that the proposal from Belarus would receive positive response, and the European side and Belarus could work together to resolve the issue through dialogue. Political consideration should give way to the collective resolve to address common challenge. Finally, Mr. Chairman, China is glad to see the situation in Belarus is stabilizing. We are confident that the people of Belarus will overcome all difficulties and continue to maintain their national unity and social stability through their own efforts. We call on the international community to play a constructive role in this regard. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We have heard the statements by the members of the UN Security Council. Now we will proceed with statements by other member states of the United Nations. I would like to give the floor to European External Action Service, Deputy Secretary General for Political Affairs, Mr. Mora. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. Let me first thank the Estonian presidency for organizing this meeting on the situation in Belarus. It's the third time in this year that Belarus is discussed in this format. The situation continues to worsen and most centrally deserves the attention of the UN Security Council. Over the last year, The ruthless repression following the elections of 9 August 2020 has continued and reached an unprecedented level. More than 35,000 people have been sentenced and detained. The regime continues its systematic effort to silence all remaining independent voices in the country, independent press, human rights defenders, and civil society at large. Prominent representatives of the opposition to Lukashenko, like Mr. Barbarica and Mrs. Kalashnikova, for example, have been sentenced to long prison sentences in political trials conducted behind closed doors. There are now more than 800 political prisoners in the country, a number that continues to increase. There is evidence of widespread use of torture, of systematic human rights violations in prisons and detention facilities. It is clear that the regime is a threat to its own citizens. Increasingly, Lukashenko's regime is also a threat to international peace and security. The forced landing of the Ryanair flight between 2 EU capitals on 24 May 2021 in order to arrest a journalist and his companion was a flagrant breach of international norms, jeopardizing international civil aviation safety. It was also an act that extended the terror of the regime beyond the borders of Belarus. The state-run instrumentalization of migrants is another example of Lukashenko's blatant disregard of international norms. Vulnerable persons are transported to the EU borders under false pretense in order to put pressure on the European Union's external borders. The exploitation of the migrants' vulnerable situation for political motives is a serious violation of their human rights. Mr. President, the EU has reacted firmly to the illegal actions of Lukashenko's regime. We have repeatedly highlighted that dialogue with democratic forces leading to fair and free elections is the only possible solution to the Belarusian crisis. There has been no response from Belarusian authorities other than further repression. The European Union, like other members of the international community, has imposed robust sanctions on Lukashenko's regime as a response to the violations of human rights and international norms. We continue to provide strong support to civil society in Belarus, and we take part in the efforts to ensure accountability for the crimes committed by the Belarusian regime. Mr. President, I thank you again for bringing the situation in Belarus to the attention of the UN Security Council. The European Union will continue to stand firm against the Lukashenko's regime's human rights violations in Belarus and the unlawful actions directed against its citizens and its neighbors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Belarus. Permanent Representative, His Excellency, Mr. Rybakov. Please, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, so this is yet another Arria formula event on Belarus. Our participation here is neither our cooperation nor any sort of a dialogue with the organizers on the issues as outlined in your concept note. We make this statement simply because this is a country-specific event and Belarus is the targeted country. In this connection, I will not limit my statement to 3 minutes, but will speak a little bit longer. In a way, we are grateful to Estonia. In fact, Estonia once again has highlighted the aggressive behavior of neighboring countries towards Belarus, even if this was not Estonia's intention. At the same time, this is also another excellent opportunity for member states to witness Estonia's failure to deliver at the United Nations Security Council. This obsessive desire to discuss Belarus testifies to the crisis of Estonia's membership in the Security Council. The meeting has nothing to do with international peace and security, and therefore it is a clear abuse of the mandate of this primary body of the United Nations. There is only one explanation to such behavior. It is much easier for Estonia to exploit the so-called Belarusian topic for the sole purpose of desperately trying to score political points, rather than to responsibly discharge its duties of the UN Security Council member. During its term in the Security Council, Estonia has not accomplished commitments undertaken during its election campaign. Serving the interests of the European Union at the expense of Belarus can hardly be viewed as a great accomplishment. The official position of the Republic of Belarus was clearly and fully articulated by the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the general debate of the 76th session of the General Assembly. I can only reiterate the following. Belarus did not orchestrate refugee crisis on its western borders. Belarus did not violate its obligations towards refugees who seek asylum in Western countries. Incidentally, in those same Western countries that attacked or destroyed the countries of origin of refugees. Belarus fully cooperates with international organizations to resolve the issue. Last month, we provided access to a representative of the UNHCR to assess the situation on the ground and to hold meetings with relevant authorities. Poland and Lithuania block refugees, including women and children, from entering and push them back to Belarus, using force, violence, and threats. Does this correspond to what is always presented as humanitarian European values? The European Union has so far made no attempts whatsoever to even remind Poland or Lithuania of the need to fulfill their international obligations. Humanitarian missions do not have access to the border regions in those countries. European officials and representatives of international organizations and NGOs do not have contacts with political leadership of the two countries on this issue. Ignoring its own decisions on dealing with refugees, on the freedom of speech, and on the rule of law, while aggressively imposing similar demands on other sovereign states, has unfortunately become a new normalcy of the European Union that never misses an opportunity to demonstrate, at least in words, its high morals. Banning flights operated by the Belarusian national air carrier, Belavia, in the absence of a definitive conclusion from the investigation by the International Civil Aviation Organization is yet another manifestation of the cynical policies of the West, of the collective West, not only towards Belarus, but to the entire international community. This is a blatant violation of the right to a free movement and an act of dishonest competition. This is also a shocking ungratefulness to the air carrier that helped evacuate thousands of European citizens and some American citizens at the height of pandemic-related lockdown last year. In general, it is not Estonia's business, even when or if pushed by its supervisors to lecture Belarus. The country that officially glorifies Nazis, the country that abuses the memory of World War II victims, the country that represses its own minorities and violates their human rights, the country that is far beyond the standards of basic freedoms, does not have any moral ground or any moral right to criticize or to lecture Belarus. The participation of the UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights in this meeting draws our particular attention and interest. We can only hope that Ms. Keris is taking part in this theater of the absurd in her personal capacity and at her personal initiative, and that the UN Secretary General has been duly informed. Getting the United Nations involved at the country-specific events that are held at private initiative of individual states and that have not been authorized by any UN decisions without the consent of the targeted country is shameful and unfriendly, and is also an outrageous violation of the principles of impartiality, non-interference, and independence that all UN officials must abide by. I wish to emphasize that it looks particularly preposterous and pathetic when Belarus is lectured on human rights, on how to organize and conduct elections, on how to deal with migration crisis, and on other related issues by those who have failed miserably in dealing with similar problems and issues in their own countries, including situations where citizens are labeled domestic terrorists and are punished for demonstrating their views. Just a few words to those who stand in line to criticize Belarus. To you, Belarus looks like a convenient target. Obediently following orders from your puppeteers from Brussels and Washington, you make brave statements on various issues related to Belarus, including on presidential elections. We are still waiting for your similarly brave statements on the latest presidential elections in the United States or on numerous human rights violations in European Union countries. Neither collectively nor individually, you are not a bright example for others to follow. You are not a shining beacon of democracy. You do not look like a beacon at all. Rather, especially when you are lecturing us, you look like a fool on the hill. Once again, we urge Estonia to wisely utilize its remaining time on the Security Council to courageously organize similar events on the human rights situations in countries on both sides of the Atlantic. And a very brief note, incidentally, just to demonstrate the incredible popularity of this event, let me inform you that it has been followed on YouTube at its peak by 100 people. 10 of these 100 people are from my mission to the United Nations. And believe me, this is for business, not for pleasure. There were also frantic messages on the internet urging followers to send the link for this show to others to mobilize more support and more interest. I thank you.
To Malta, Permanent Representative, Her Excellency Ms. Fraser. Please, the floor is yours.
Madam Chair, first of all, let me thank Estonia and the other sponsors for convening this meeting, as well as the briefers for their participation. Malta attaches great value to the protection of human rights and is a firm advocate of the notion that human rights are a universal principle which should guide our national and international policies. Malta acknowledges that all countries need to adopt an introspective approach to address their national human rights issues, as the best approach is to lead by example. Malta joins other United Nations member states in calling on the Belarusian authorities to adhere to the country's international obligations and to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, end the repression against civil society, and ensure accountability for human rights violations or abuses. In addition, Malta calls on Belarus to fully cooperate with international and regional human rights monitoring mechanisms, including by granting them unhindered access to Belarus and to implement their recommendations. Malta remains deeply concerned by reports of serious human rights violations taking place in Belarus. Disproportionate violence, together with unjustified arrests, must come to an end, as the recent sentencing of the Belarusian activist Maria Kalashnikova and Maxim Znak reflect the oppression of the Belarusian people, persecution of civil society, threats towards independent media, and the constant increase of political prisoners continue to be troublesome. Malta likewise believes that the act of forcing a European plane on an intra-EU flight to divert to another airport and which led to the arrest of Mr. Roman Protasevich, together with that of his girlfriend, Ms. Sofia Sapaga, cannot be justified. Malta also underlines the importance for the international community to offer its strong support to the people of Belarus. Engagement and solidarity are indispensable to further assist Belarusian civil society to reach their democratic aspirations. We therefore also call upon the Belarusian authorities to initiate a broad and inclusive dialogue with Belarusian civil society in the collective interest of the Belarusian people. In this spirit, we join in calling upon the international community to remain engaged in its support towards Belarusian society, all together with the country's independent media, in securing Belarus's free path towards democracy. Finally, we also urge Belarus to abolish the death penalty and, as a first step, to introduce a moratorium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to give a floor to Liechtenstein, Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Venawezer. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Liechtenstein has followed the developments in Belarus with increasing concern. The situation continues to be characterized by systematic, serious and massive violations of human rights, and more recently has turned into a threat to regional stability. There is overwhelming evidence that the presidential elections of 2020 were neither fair nor free. We express solidarity with all those who have protested peacefully and demanded free and fair elections, and we condemn all violence perpetrated against them. We pay particular tribute to the strong role women have been playing in the protest movement and support their role as agents for political change. The recommendations by the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE offer the authorities in Belarus a good starting point for ending violence and human rights violations and for organizing free and genuine elections. Full cooperation with the relevant mandates established by the Human Rights Council is furthermore of the essence. While the authorities continue to oppress their own people, they also openly flout the most basic rules of international law governing the relations between nations, as evidenced by the forced landing of a civilian aircraft, endangering aviation safety, the safety of passengers and crew, and by the resulting kidnapping and arbitrary detention. The authorities have now also resorted to manipulating migration movements by taking advantage of desperate and vulnerable citizens from third countries to initiate illegal border crossings from Belarus to neighboring countries. We express our solidarity with those who fall prey to such machinations, as well as states who are targeted and put under pressure through such attempts to weaponize illegal migration and to exploit the misery of countless individuals. These inhumane practices pose a clear threat to peace and security and should find an appropriate response from the United Nations Security Council in order to help chart a way back for Belarus into the framework of the rules regulating international relations in the interest of their own people and the peaceful relations between states. I thank you.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor now to Venezuela. Permanent Representative, His Excellency Mr. Perez Estaran. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good morning. Venezuela's participation in today's informal meeting shall in no way be interpreted as an endorsement to this initiative. Quite the opposite. We consider that this virtual gathering is an unfriendly act that is part of a playbook that we ourselves know very well, and that is part of a strategy aimed at attacking and discrediting an independent and sovereign member state of the international community, flagrantly violating the tenets of the UN Charter particularly the principles of non-intervention in the internal affairs of states and the right to self-determination of peoples. In line with its principal position, Venezuela rejects the selective and politicized approach of peace and security and human rights, as well as the securitization of migration matters, especially when not counting on the full consent and participation of the concerned states. Such approaches have proved to be not only ineffective, but they have also resulted in the promotion of destabilization, and they have caused great human pain and suffering, to which then their promoters show blatant indifference. This informal meeting, despite propaganda efforts, is not one of the Security Council, as the subject in question is not part of its agenda and it's well beyond its purview. Hence, it must be acknowledged that it will contribute in no way to advancing ongoing diplomatic and political processes aimed at redressing, in a realistic and comprehensive manner, the differences or other outstanding issues that may indeed exist. We therefore reject all attempts at weaponizing the United Nations and its main bodies against any of its member states. The approach we have seen today, nevertheless, make us conclude that the real objective of today's gathering is to advance selfish national interest and interventionist agendas, while attempting to legitimize something that is illegal from each and every single point of view, the imposition of so-called sanctions against Belarus, which is basically war through other means, and which consequently produce death, pain, and ultimately amount to a crime against humanity. This is the real threat today. Thus, we further reject the continued attempts to undermine the peace and stability of the Republic of Belarus and at meddling into its internal affairs. As advocates for the defense of the UN Charter, Venezuela reiterates the urgency and importance of renewing the values and purposes that inspire the establishment of our organization, of fully complying with the essence of diplomacy and politics in the interest of promoting the peaceful settlement of disputes, and of once and for all accepting that each people has the inalienable right to freely determine its own political, economic, social, and cultural system without foreign interference, which remains to date the main driver of war and poverty around the world. To conclude, we want to voice our serious concern at the decision of the sponsors of this informal event to prevent certain member states from joining us today for reasons that, to this very moment, still remain unclear, while shedding light on the true intentions and non-constructive spirit of the organizers, who seem to prefer to avoid views different to their own, disowning the very diversity of our world and the nature of multilateralism, which is based on the promotion of dialogue, tolerance, and understanding. We make vows for promptly coming to our senses and revisiting the provisions of the UN Charter. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our meeting today. We have heard tragic insights and received valuable first-hand information. Our meeting today clearly demonstrates that political repressions in Belarus are so extensive that the international community just cannot turn a blind eye to them. It is of utmost importance that we continue to support and show solidarity with the people of Belarus. Not sure at all, but very much hope that this meeting has made the authorities of Belarus reflect on the situation and they start taking steps in a positive direction. Until then, I'm afraid this matter must remain high on our agenda. Let me be crystal clear here that prosperous, democratic, and sovereign Belarus in the family of European-friendly nations is in our common interest. On behalf of my country, Estonia, and all the co-sponsors, I sincerely thank you all for your valuable participation. Thank you.